Elon Musk test drives a broken car, then buys the factory it came from. The dusty parking lot stretched endlessly under the midday sun, the heat shimmering off the cracked asphalt in waves. Rows of used cars, their paint faded and their tires caked with grime, sat haphazardly like forgotten relics from another era. The faint smell of oil and rubber hung in the air, blending with the occasional whiff of stale coffee from the tiny office near the entrance. A young salesman stood near the edge of the lot, his collared shirt damp with sweat. He adjusted his tie nervously, glancing toward the man who had just stepped out of a sleek black Tesla. The contrast between the luxury car and the worn-out lot was impossible to ignore, and it wasn't lost on anyone watching. The man himself seemed oddly out of place. Elon Musk, casually dressed in jeans and a fitted gray shirt, surveyed the lot with a curious, almost amused expression. He carried himself with the easy confidence of someone used to commanding attention, though he seemed completely unfazed by the stares he was already attracting from the dealership staff. "Mr. Musk," the salesman said, hurrying forward with an eager smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Welcome. I wasn't expecting someone like you here today." "Someone like me?" Elon asked, raising an eyebrow as he extended a hand. The salesman hesitated, his handshake too firm as he chuckled nervously. "Well, someone of your stature. We don't get many Teslas in this lot, let alone their owners." Elon's lips twitched into a faint smile, though it didn't linger. He glanced past the salesman, his sharp eyes scanning the rows of cars with a focus that suggested he wasn't here to browse casually. "I'm not looking for a Tesla," Elon said finally, his tone casual. "I want something different, something unconventional." The salesman blinked, clearly unsure how to interpret the request. "Unconventional? Well, we've got a wide range of models here. Some classics, some newer ones, and a few fixer-uppers if you're into projects." "Projects," Elon repeated thoughtfully, his gaze landing on a particularly battered sedan near the back of the lot. Its once red paint had faded to a dull rust color, and one of its side mirrors dangled precariously, held on by duct tape. He pointed toward it. "That one." The salesman followed his gaze and faltered, his forced smile slipping. "That one? Oh, that's probably not what you're looking for. It's been here a while, needs a lot of work. Probably more trouble than it's worth." "Perfect," Elon said, already walking toward the car. The sedan looked even worse up close. The driver's side door creaked loudly as Elon pulled it open, and the interior smelled faintly of mildew and old vinyl. The upholstery was torn in several places, and the dashboard was coated in a fine layer of dust. A jagged crack ran across the windshield, and the engine made a low, ominous groan as the salesman reluctantly started it. "You're serious about this one?" the salesman asked, his tone incredulous as he handed Elon the keys. "Very," Elon replied simply, sliding into the driver's seat. The springs beneath the cushion groaned under his weight, and he adjusted the seat with a sharp click before gripping the steering wheel. The salesman stood back nervously, watching as Elon rolled the window down. "Just so you know, it's not exactly in its prime. The alignment's off, the brakes are sticky, and the transmission's been acting up." Elon tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Sounds like fun." With a twist of the key, the engine sputtered to life, coughing out a cloud of smoke that drifted lazily into the air. The sound drew the attention of a mechanic leaning against the garage in the far corner of the lot. He straightened up, wiping his hands on his overalls as he walked over, his expression a mix of curiosity and disbelief. "You're taking that thing for a spin?" the mechanic called out, his voice gruff but tinged with amusement. "Good luck." She barely made it onto the lot. Elon didn't respond immediately, his focus on the feel of the steering wheel beneath his hands. After a moment, he leaned out the window and asked, "When's the last time someone drove it?" The mechanic scratched his head. "Months, maybe. We had a guy look at it once, but he said it wasn't worth the trouble. Honestly, it's been collecting dust ever since." "Good," Elon said, shifting the car into gear. The transmission groaned loudly, but the sedan lurched forward, its tires squealing faintly against the asphalt. The test drive was nothing short of disastrous. The car rattled violently with every bump in the road, and the brakes responded sluggishly, forcing Elon to adjust his speed constantly to avoid overshooting corners. The steering wheel felt loose, almost disconnected, and the engine's complaints grew louder with every passing minute. Elon, however, didn't seem fazed. If anything, he looked intrigued, his eyes narrowing slightly as he navigated the uneven streets surrounding the dealership. He muttered under his breath occasionally, his words inaudible to the salesman sitting stiffly in the passenger seat, gripping the door handle as though his life depended on it. "You're really putting this thing through its paces," the salesman said nervously, glancing at the speedometer as it wavered unsteadily. "Most people don't even bother taking it off the lot." Elon didn't reply. He was focused on the feel of the car, the way it responded or failed to respond to his inputs. Every jolt and shudder seemed to tell him a story, and he was listening carefully, piecing together the car's history with every mile. When they returned to the lot, the sedan groaned loudly as Elon parked it near the garage. The engine sputtered once before cutting out entirely, leaving a faint trail of smoke drifting from the exhaust. The mechanic from earlier approached, his hands on his hips. "Well, how'd she do?" Elon stepped out of the car, his expression unreadable. He handed the keys back to the salesman without a word, brushing a faint smudge of grease off his hands. "She's got potential," he said finally, his tone thoughtful. "But she's not the problem." The salesman frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Elon glanced toward the garage, where several other cars in various states of disrepair were parked. His gaze lingered for a moment before he turned back to the salesman and the mechanic. "I'll need more information," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Who built it?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as Elon walked back toward the main office, leaving the salesman and mechanic staring after him with puzzled expressions. The salesman and the mechanic exchanged a glance, their confusion mirrored in the furrow of their brows as they watched Elon walk away. The question lingered in the air, heavy with implications they didn't fully understand. Who built it? It wasn't the kind of question you heard at a used car lot, especially not about a car that had clearly seen better decades, let alone days. Did he mean the manufacturer? The salesman asked finally, his voice uncertain. The mechanic shrugged, wiping his hands on his oil-streaked rag. "Beats me. That guy's got an angle, though. You don't ask a question like that unless you've got a reason." Elon pushed open the door to the small office, its faded wood creaking under his hand. The scent of stale coffee hit him immediately, mingling with the faint tang of grease that seemed to permeate the entire dealership. Inside, a woman sat behind a cluttered desk, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose as she typed something into an ancient computer. She glanced up as he entered, her eyes narrowing slightly in recognition. "You're the guy with the Tesla, right?" she asked, leaning back in her chair. "That's me," Elon replied, his tone polite but distant. He scanned the room briefly, his gaze settling on a row of filing cabinets against the far wall. "I need to know more about the car I just drove." The woman blinked, clearly caught off guard. "The old sedan? Why, planning to buy it?" "Not yet," Elon said, his eyes flicking back to her. "But I want to know where it came from, how it ended up here. Anything you can tell me." She hesitated, her fingers drumming lightly against the desk. "I mean, I could pull the records, but that thing's been on the lot for months. Nobody's shown any interest in it until today." "I'm interested," Elon said simply. There was something in his tone, not quite commanding, but firm enough that the woman sighed and turned back to her computer. She clicked a few keys, her lips pursing as she waited for the slow machine to catch up. "It came in on a trade-in," she said finally. "Guy didn't say much about it, just that it wasn't worth fixing. It's been sitting in the back ever since." "Who traded it in?" Elon asked. The woman squinted at the screen, her finger scrolling down a list of entries. Name was Donaldson. Edward Donaldson. Local guy, I think. Don't have much else on him, though. Elon nodded slowly, his mind turning over the information. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the edge of the desk. "What about the manufacturer?" Any details on where it was built? The woman frowned, clearly puzzled by the question. It's a 20-year-old car, Mr. Musk. Probably came out of one of those big plants in Detroit or somewhere overseas. Why does it matter? Elon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he straightened and glanced at the filing cabinets again. Would you mind if I looked at the paperwork myself? The woman hesitated, her brow furrowing. It's not exactly standard policy to let customers dig through our records. I'm not exactly a standard customer, Elon said, his faint smile softening the statement but not diminishing its weight. After a moment, she shrugged and gestured toward the cabinets. Knock yourself out. Just don't mess up the order. I've got enough to deal with as it is. Elon crossed the room and opened one of the drawers, the metallic clatter of sliding metal breaking the silence. Inside were rows of manila folders, each labeled with handwritten tags that spoke to the dealership's outdated filing system. He flipped through them quickly, his eyes scanning for anything that might catch his attention. The mechanic wandered into the office, leaning against the doorframe as he watched Elon work. You really care that much about that old junker? He asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Elon didn't look up. I care about where it came from. The mechanic let out a low whistle, crossing his arms. Most people just care if it runs. You're taking this to a whole other level. That's what I do, Elon said absently, pulling out a folder and opening it on the desk. Inside was a stack of service records, inspection reports, and other paperwork that detailed the car's long and troubled history. Elon sifted through them quickly, piecing together the timeline with practiced efficiency. The car had changed hands several times over the years, each owner leaving behind a trail of minor repairs and ignored warnings. One document, however, caught his attention. It was an original invoice from the factory, dated over 2 decades ago. The letterhead bore the name of a manufacturing plant he vaguely recognized, though the company itself was no longer in business. Elon stared at the paper for a long moment, his mind racing. He could almost see the assembly line where the car had been built, the workers moving with mechanical precision as they pieced together a vehicle that was never meant to last this long. Something about it didn't sit right with him, something he couldn't quite put into words yet. The salesman appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened and his face shiny with sweat. So, Mr. Musk, he began hesitantly, you're really interested in that car? Huh? Interested is one way to put it, Elon said, slipping the invoice back into the folder. The salesman exchanged a glance with the mechanic, then turned back to Elon. I mean, we're happy to sell it to you, of course, but it's not exactly your usual kind of purchase, is it? Elon closed the folder and slid it back into the cabinet, his movements deliberate. What makes you think you know my usual kind of purchase? The question wasn't accusatory, but it carried enough weight to make the salesman stammer. I just figured, Tesla and all. You're a luxury guy, not exactly the fixer-upper type. Elon smiled faintly, though his eyes remained serious. Every Tesla starts somewhere, he said. Sometimes it's worth looking back at where things began. The mechanic let out a low laugh, shaking his head. You're a strange guy, Musk. No offense. None taken, Elon replied, his tone light. But I'm not done yet. He turned back to the woman at the desk. I'll need the contact information for the man who traded it in. Edward Donaldson. The woman hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. I'm not sure we can just give out that kind of information, privacy laws and all. Elon's gaze didn't waver. I understand, but I think you'll find I have a way of making things happen. The woman at the desk hesitated, her fingers poised over the keyboard as she studied Elon's expression. There was something unnerving about the way he looked at her. Not threatening, but commanding in a way that made it difficult to refuse. She glanced toward the mechanic and the salesman, who were standing near the doorway, both of them watching the interaction with poorly disguised curiosity. Look, she said finally, pushing her glasses up her nose, even if I wanted to help you, we're not exactly equipped to hand out customer information like that. The guy traded in the car months ago. For all we know, he's long gone. Elon tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. You said he was local. That means he has ties to the area. You have his name and you have records. That's all I need." The mechanic let out a low whistle, crossing his arms as he leaned against the doorframe. "Persistent, aren't you?" Elon ignored him. His attention remained fixed on the woman, who sighed deeply and turned back to her computer. Her fingers tapped at the keyboard, the clunky machine whirring faintly as it processed her request. After a moment, she frowned, squinting at the screen. "Well, you're not wrong. Donaldson's address is listed here, but..." She trailed off, biting her lip. "It's out of date. This place hasn't been occupied for at least 6 months. Maybe longer." "Let me see," Elon said, stepping closer to the desk. The woman hesitated but turned the monitor slightly so he could read the information. The address was for a modest house in the outskirts of town, in a neighborhood Elon vaguely recognized from the drive-in. It wasn't much, it was a start. "Thanks," Elon said, straightening. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black wallet, extracting a business card. He handed it to the woman, who took it with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. "If you think of anything else," Elon continued, "call me. Day or night." The woman glanced at the card, her eyebrows lifting slightly as she read the embossed letters spelling out his name and title. "You're really serious about this, huh?" "Always," Elon replied. He turned to leave, but the mechanic stepped into his path, blocking the doorway with a skeptical expression. "Hang on a second," the man said, holding up a grease-streaked hand. "You're telling me you're gonna track down some random guy over a car that barely runs? What's your angle here?" Elon regarded him calmly, his hands slipping into his pockets. "Sometimes the smallest details tell the biggest stories. You'd be surprised what you can learn if you're willing to look." The mechanic shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're a strange one, Musk. But hey, it's your time to waste." Elon stepped past him without another word, heading back toward the lot where his Tesla gleamed in the sunlight. The salesman jogged to catch up with him, his tie flapping awkwardly against his chest. "So, about the sedan," the salesman began, his voice tinged with nervous energy. "Are you planning to buy it? Or was the test drive just, a one-off thing?" Elon paused by the Tesla, turning to face him. "That depends on what I find." The salesman blinked, clearly unsure how to interpret the response. "What you find? You mean about the car?" Elon didn't answer. Instead, he opened the door to his Tesla and slid into the driver's seat, his movements smooth and efficient. He rolled down the window, his gaze fixed on the salesman. "Hold on to it for now," he said. "I might be back." Before the salesman could respond, the Tesla hummed to life, its electric motor nearly silent as Elon pulled out of the lot. The salesman and the mechanic watched him go, their expressions a mix of confusion and intrigue. "What do you think he's up to?" the salesman asked, turning to the mechanic. The mechanic shrugged, lighting a cigarette as he leaned against one of the rusted-out cars near the garage. "Whatever it is, it's way above our pay grade." The drive to the address listed in the dealership's records was uneventful but gave Elon plenty of time to think. The streets became quieter as he left the bustling city behind, the buildings giving way to suburban houses with neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences. Eventually, the houses grew older and more spaced out, their yards overgrown and their paint peeling in the afternoon sun. The address led him to a small, single-story house at the end of a cul-de-sac. The driveway was cracked and empty, the front yard littered with fallen leaves and bits of debris. A "for sale" sign leaned crookedly against the mailbox, its lettering faded from exposure to the elements. Elon parked at the curb and stepped out of the Tesla, his shoes crunching softly against the gravel as he approached the house. The windows were dark, and the door was firmly shut, but something about the place felt off. It wasn't just abandoned, it felt forgotten, like a relic from a time no one wanted to remember. He knocked on the door, more out of habit than expectation. The sound echoed hollowly, confirming what he already suspected. No one was home. Elon stepped back, his eyes scanning the property. He noticed a small shed in the backyard, its wooden frame sagging slightly under the weight of years. The padlock on the door was rusted, but the chain looked new, as though someone had replaced it recently. Curious, Elon made his way around the side of the house, the tall grass brushing against his legs as he approached the shed. He crouched to examine the lock, noting the faint scuff marks on the chain where it had been handled. Whoever had been here last hadn't been gone for long. He straightened, his mind working through the possibilities. The house might be empty now, but someone had cared enough to secure the shed. That meant there was still a connection to this place, something tying it to the car and its former owner. Elon pulled out his phone, snapping a few pictures of the property before dialing a number from memory. The line rang twice before a voice answered, crisp and professional. "Good afternoon, Mr. Musk," the voice said. "How can I assist you?" "I need a title search on a property," Elon said, his tone brisk. He rattled off the address, his eyes scanning the shed as he spoke. "And any recent transactions involving the owner. Send me what you find as soon as possible." "Understood, sir," the voice replied. "You'll have the information within the hour." Elon hung up and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his gaze lingering on the shed for a moment longer. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture was still incomplete. He didn't know what he was looking for yet, but he could feel it, the faint pull of something significant just out of reach. He turned back toward the Tesla, his steps measured as he left the quiet house behind. For now, the search would continue elsewhere. The documents arrived faster than Elon expected, pinging onto his phone in a neat email with the subject line: "Requested title and transaction history, 121 Maple Drive." He parked in an empty lot on the outskirts of town, the sun dipping lower in the sky as he leaned back in his seat and opened the attachment. The property's history was unremarkable at first glance. It had changed hands several times over the past 2 decades, with a string of average buyers and unremarkable mortgages. Nothing stood out until the most recent transfer, a foreclosure 6 months ago, followed by an auction. The buyer's name was listed simply as Donaldson Holdings, with no further details. Elon frowned, his eyes narrowing slightly. He tapped the name into a search engine, but the results were predictably vague. Donaldson Holdings wasn't a major corporation or even a well-known entity. Its digital footprint was practically non-existent, save for a few scattered mentions in obscure real estate filings. He closed the search and opened the next file, a list of liens and claims attached to the property. Most were routine, a few unpaid utility bills, a contractor's lien for a fence repair, but one stood out, a manufacturing lien from a now-defunct factory called Granite Precision Motors. Granite Precision Motors. The name jogged something in Elon's memory, though it was faint, like a half-remembered conversation from years ago. He tapped the name into his phone, scrolling through the sparse search results until a familiar logo caught his eye. It was a small, independent automaker that had shut down years ago after a series of financial scandals. Elon had heard about them briefly during Tesla's early days, though their story had been little more than a cautionary tale of mismanagement and overreach. Why would a defunct automaker have a lien on a suburban house? And what connection did it have to the battered sedan sitting in that dusty dealership lot? The questions gnawed at him as he stared at the screen, his mind racing through possibilities. Granite Precision Motors had been small, too small to compete with the giants in Detroit or the tech-forward startups cropping up on the West Coast. They had specialized in mid-range sedans and compact cars, the kind of vehicles that were functional but uninspired. Yet something about their approach had stuck with Elon. A reputation for experimenting with unconventional materials and designs, pushing the boundaries of what a small operation could achieve. But it hadn't been enough. Their collapse had been swift and messy, leaving behind a trail of unpaid debts and abandoned projects. Most of their assets had been sold off at auction, their workforce scattered. It was old history now, a footnote in the industry's evolution. Yet here it was, surfacing in the most unexpected way. Elon sat back, tapping his fingers lightly against the steering wheel as he thought. The pieces weren't fitting together yet, but the edges were starting to align. The car, the factory, the house, they were connected somehow, though the exact thread eluded him. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from his assistant, crisp and to the point. Additional information incoming. Former employee records attached. Possible lead. Elon opened the file, scanning quickly through the list of names. Most were unfamiliar, but one caught his attention: Edward Donaldson. He was listed as a mid-level engineer, part of Granite's R&D division, with a tenure spanning nearly a decade. The notes on his file were sparse, but one line stood out: specialized in experimental drivetrain technologies, instrumental in early-stage prototypes. Elon's gaze lingered on the words, his mind piecing together fragments of the story. Donaldson hadn't just been an employee, he'd been at the heart of Granite's innovation efforts. If the car he traded in was a relic of that work, it might explain why it had caught Elon's attention. Even in its broken state, there was something about it that felt deliberate, as though it carried the echoes of an idea left unfinished. But why trade it in? Why let it deteriorate in a used car lot instead of preserving it as a piece of history? And why was Donaldson's name now tied to a shell corporation with no discernible purpose? The questions piled up, each one more perplexing than the last. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time Elon arrived at his next destination, a nondescript diner on the edge of town. It wasn't the kind of place he frequented often. Its faded sign and flickering neon lights spoke of a time when it had been something better, something brighter. Now it was just another waypoint for truckers and locals passing through. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of grease and coffee, the faint hum of an old jukebox filling the gaps between conversation. Elon scanned the room quickly, his eyes landing on a man sitting alone at a corner booth. He was in his late 50s, his hair graying at the temples and his shoulders slightly hunched. A cup of coffee sat in front of him, untouched, as he stared out the window with a faraway look. Edward Donaldson. Elon approached the booth, his footsteps quiet against the worn linoleum floor. Donaldson didn't look up until Elon slid into the seat across from him, his movements deliberate but unassuming. "Mind if I join you?" Elon asked, his tone polite but firm. Donaldson blinked, his expression shifting from surprise to suspicion in an instant. "Do I know you?" "You do now," Elon said, offering a faint smile. He extended a hand. "Elon Musk." Donaldson hesitated, then shook his hand briefly before pulling back. "What's this about?" Elon leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the edge of the table. "I drove your car today, the one you traded in at that dealership." Donaldson's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. "The old sedan? Why the hell would you want that thing?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Elon said. "It's not just a car, is it?" Donaldson's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening slightly around the coffee cup. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Elon replied, his voice calm but unwavering. "You spent years at Granite Precision Motors. You worked on their prototypes, didn't you?" Donaldson stiffened, his gaze darting toward the door before returning to Elon. "Granite's dead. Has been for years. Whatever you think you're chasing, you're wasting your time." "Maybe," Elon said, tilting his head slightly. "But something tells me there's more to the story. And I'm not the kind of person who gives up easily." Donaldson let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You've got no idea what you're digging into, do you?" "Not yet," Elon admitted. "But I will." For a long moment, Donaldson said nothing, his eyes fixed on the table as though weighing his next move. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and guarded. "You're in over your head, Musk. Walk away while you still can." Donaldson's words hung heavy in the air between them, his warning lingering like a storm cloud. Elon didn't move, his gaze steady as he studied the man across from him. The diner around them felt frozen in time, the soft clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation fading into the background. "I don't walk away," Elon said, his tone quiet but firm. "Especially not when something doesn't add up." Donaldson let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "You think you can just come in here, flash your name around, and get answers? It's not that simple." Elon leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the edge of the table. "You're right, it's not simple. But that doesn't mean it's impossible." Donaldson's eyes narrowed, his fingers tightening around the coffee cup in front of him. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but then he slumped back in his seat, letting out a heavy sigh. "You don't know what you're asking for," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then explain it to me," Elon said, his tone unyielding. Donaldson glanced around the diner, his eyes darting toward the counter where a waitress was refilling someone's coffee. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Granite wasn't what people think it was. Sure, we made cars, decent ones too, for a while. But that wasn't all we were doing." "What else?" Elon asked, his curiosity piqued. Donaldson hesitated, his gaze flicking to the window as though he expected someone to be watching. "We were experimenting," he said finally, "on designs, materials, technologies. Stuff that wasn't ready for the public. Hell, some of it wasn't even legal." Elon's expression didn't change, but his mind was racing. He'd heard whispers of this before, rumors that Granite had dabbled in experimental tech, but nothing concrete had ever surfaced. Most of the stories had been written off as conspiracy theories, wild speculation fueled by the company's dramatic collapse. "What kind of experiments?" Elon pressed. Donaldson shook his head. "It doesn't matter. The company's gone, the projects are buried, and the people who worked on them have scattered. Whatever you think you're chasing, it's not worth it." "It's worth it to me," Elon said. Donaldson stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he let out a weary sigh, running a hand through his graying hair. "You're relentless, I'll give you that. But I'm telling you, you're better off leaving this alone." "That's not going to happen," Elon replied simply. Before Donaldson could respond, the waitress approached their table, a fresh pot of coffee in hand. She smiled politely, her eyes flicking between the two men. "Need a refill?" she asked. Donaldson shook his head, mumbling a quick, "No, thanks," before the waitress turned and walked away. He watched her go, his shoulders tense, before turning back to Elon. "You don't give up, do you?" Donaldson said, his tone laced with resignation. "Never," Elon said. Donaldson let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Fine. You want to know what you're dealing with? Then I'll tell you. But you're not going to like it." The drive to Donaldson's storage unit was silent, the only sound the soft hum of Elon's Tesla as it cut through the night. Donaldson sat in the passenger seat, his arms crossed and his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He hadn't said much since they left the diner, but the tension radiating from him was palpable. The storage facility was located on the outskirts of town, a sprawling complex of metal units surrounded by a chain-link fence. The fluorescent lights lining the perimeter cast a cold, bluish glow over the gravel lot, making the shadows seem sharper and more menacing. Donaldson directed Elon to a unit near the back of the lot, his voice terse as he rattled off the number. He stepped out of the car and fumbled with a set of keys, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked the padlock and slid the door open. Inside, the unit was crammed with boxes, tools, and the remnants of a life that had clearly been uprooted. Old car parts were scattered across the floor, their surfaces coated in dust, and a battered workbench stood against the far wall, cluttered with tools and stacks of yellowed papers. Donaldson stepped inside, flipping on a single overhead light that flickered faintly before settling into a dim glow. He moved toward the back of the unit, rummaging through a stack of boxes until he found what he was looking for. "This," he said, pulling out a thick binder and slapping it onto the workbench, "is what's left of my career at Granite." Elon stepped closer, his eyes scanning the binder's worn cover. Donaldson opened it, revealing pages of diagrams, handwritten notes, and faded photographs of prototypes. The designs were intricate, almost futuristic, with sleek curves and unconventional shapes that hinted at a level of innovation far beyond what Granite had been known for. "These were our early concepts," Donaldson said, his voice tinged with a mix of pride and regret. "We were trying to build something different, something better." Elon flipped through the pages, his expression focused. "These don't look like standard sedans." "They weren't," Donaldson admitted. "We were experimenting with lightweight materials, modular designs, even hybrid drivetrains. But we didn't have the funding or the infrastructure to make it work. Every time we got close, something went wrong." "What about the sedan you traded in?" Elon asked, his gaze sharp. "Was it one of these?" Donaldson hesitated, his fingers brushing against the edge of the binder. Not exactly. That car. It wasn't supposed to leave the factory. It was a prototype, built from scraps and leftover parts. A Frankenstein's monster, really? Then why did you keep it? Elon pressed. Donaldson's expression darkened. Because it was the last thing I had. The factory shut down before we could finish it. Everything else was seized, sold off, or destroyed. That car was the only piece of granite I could save. And now it's sitting in a used car lot, Elon said, his tone neutral. Donaldson let out a bitter laugh. Yeah. Funny how that worked out. Huh. Elon's eyes narrowed as he closed the binder. Why now? Why trade it in after all these years? Donaldson didn't answer immediately. He looked away, his jaw tightening as he stared at the far wall of the storage unit. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and strained. Because someone came looking for it. Elon's breath hitched slightly, but he didn't let it show. Who? Donaldson shook his head. I don't know. They didn't leave a name, just a message. Said they wanted the car, no questions asked. I didn't trust them, so I got rid of it. Figured it'd be safer if it was out of my hands. And now it's in mine, Elon said quietly. Donaldson turned back to him. His eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Musk. Granite wasn't just a company. It was an experiment, and not everything we built was meant to last. That car. It's a piece of something bigger. Something dangerous. Elon stood in the dimly lit storage unit, the weight of Donaldson's words settling like a heavy fog. The phrase, something dangerous, echoed in his mind, stirring a mixture of intrigue and caution. Dangerous could mean many things in the context of a defunct automaker, experimental materials, cutting-edge technologies prone to failure, or perhaps something more insidious. Elon had seen enough in his career to know that ambition unchecked often led to unintended consequences. Donaldson watched him carefully, his fingers gripping the edge of the workbench as though it were the only thing keeping him steady. The man looked worn, not just by time but by the weight of whatever he was carrying. His face was etched with lines that spoke of sleepless nights and hard decisions, and his eyes held a flicker of regret that he couldn't quite hide. What do you mean by dangerous? Elon asked finally, his voice calm but firm. Donaldson hesitated, his gaze dropping to the binder on the table. He flipped to another page, revealing a schematic of what appeared to be an engine, though its design was unlike anything Elon had seen before. The lines were sleek and intricate, with components that seemed almost alien in their complexity. This, Donaldson said, tapping the page, was supposed to be Granite's breakthrough, a next-generation drivetrain that could outperform anything on the market. Lightweight, efficient, and powerful enough to rival even high-performance engines. Elon studied the schematic, his mind racing as he processed the design. It's impressive, he said, but that doesn't explain what went wrong. Donaldson let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. It worked too well, at least in the beginning. The problem wasn't the engine itself, it was the materials we used. Experimental alloys, composites that weren't fully tested. On paper, it was revolutionary. In practice, it was volatile. How volatile? Elon pressed. Donaldson's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward, lowering his voice. We had a prototype explode during testing. The damn thing nearly took out half the facility. That was the beginning of the end for Granite. The investors pulled out, the lawsuits started piling up, and the rest. Well, you know how it ended. Elon's expression remained neutral, though his mind was already working through the implications. A prototype that exploded wasn't unheard of in the world of experimental engineering. Failure was part of the process. But the fact that Donaldson had described it as dangerous suggested there was more to the story. And the car in the lot? Elon asked. Does it have one of these engines? Donaldson hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the door, as though he were worried someone might overhear. It has a version of it, he admitted. A scaled-down prototype. I used it to test some ideas after the factory shut down. It wasn't supposed to be operational, it was just a proof of concept. But it is operational, Elon said, his tone even. Donaldson nodded reluctantly. Barely. I cobbled it together with whatever parts one could find, but it's unstable. That's why I kept it off the road. It wasn't safe. Elon leaned back slightly, his arms crossing as he processed the information. An unstable prototype with a volatile drivetrain, sitting unnoticed in a used car lot. The irony wasn't lost on him. Something so advanced, so full of potential, reduced to a forgotten relic. But there was more to this than just the car. The message Donaldson had received, the shadowy figures asking about it. It all pointed to a larger story, one that was far from over. What about the people looking for it? Elon asked. What do they want? Donaldson shook his head. I don't know. They didn't say. But if they're interested in that car, it's not for anything good. Did they threaten you? Elon pressed. Donaldson hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Not directly, but they didn't need to. The way they talked, the questions they asked. It was enough to know they weren't just curious collectors. Elon's gaze sharpened. He'd dealt with enough high-stakes negotiations and corporate espionage to recognize the signs of something more sinister. If someone was willing to track down a forgotten prototype from a defunct automaker, it meant there was more at stake than just nostalgia. Did you tell them where to find it? Elon asked. No, Donaldson said quickly. I told them I'd gotten rid of it, but I didn't say where. I thought if I traded it in at some random lot, it would disappear. Out of sight, out of mind. Clearly, that didn't work, Elon said. Donaldson sighed, running a hand through his hair. Yeah. Clearly, Elon's mind was already racing, considering his next move. The car was no longer just a curiosity, it was a potential liability. If it fell into the wrong hands, the consequences could be far-reaching, especially if the technology it contained was as unstable as Donaldson claimed. He glanced at the binder again, his eyes skimming the pages of notes and schematics. There was a story here, a thread that connected Granite's ambitious experiments to the present day. But the pieces didn't quite fit together yet. He needed more information, more context. Where's the factory now? Elon asked suddenly. Donaldson blinked, caught off guard by the question. The factory has been shut down for years. They auctioned off most of the equipment, and the building's just sitting there, collecting dust. Where is it? Elon repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Donaldson hesitated, then sighed. It's about 30 miles north of here, off Highway 82. You'll see the sign Granite Precision Motors. Not much left to see, though. Elon nodded, filing the information away. I'll need access to it. Donaldson stared at him, his expression a mix of disbelief and resignation. You're serious about this, aren't you? Always, Elon said. Donaldson let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You're either the smartest guy in the room or the dumbest. I haven't figured out which yet. Elon smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. I've been called both. The drive to the factory was quiet, the night stretching out ahead of Elon like an open book. The roads were empty, the headlights of his Tesla cutting through the darkness as he navigated the winding highways. The factory loomed in the distance, its silhouette stark against the horizon. The building was massive, its edges softened by years of neglect, but the faded sign bearing the Granite logo was still visible, a ghostly reminder of what once was. Elon parked near the entrance, stepping out into the cool night air. The place was silent, save for the faint rustle of wind through the overgrown grass. He approached the gates, which were chained shut with a rusted padlock. The chain looked sturdy, but the lock was old and weathered, its surface pitted with rust. Elon reached into his pocket, pulling out a small multi-tool. He examined the lock for a moment before slipping the edge of the tool into the gap, twisting it with practiced precision. The lock gave way with a satisfying click, and he pushed the gate open, its hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. The factory loomed ahead, its darkened windows staring back at him like empty eyes. Elon stepped inside, his footsteps echoing faintly against the concrete floor. The air was thick with the scent of oil and dust, a potent reminder of the work that had once taken place here. He moved deeper into the building, his eyes scanning the shadows for anything that might offer a clue. The machines were gone, their spaces marked by empty outlines and scattered debris. But the walls still bore the marks of innovation. Faded blueprints pinned to corkboards, notes scrawled in chalk on the concrete, remnants of a dream that had been abandoned too soon. Elon paused near a workbench, his hand brushing against a stack of papers that had been left behind. The edges were yellowed and brittle, but the diagrams and notes were still legible. He flipped through them quickly, his mind racing as he pieced together the story they told. The factory wasn't just a place, it was a legacy, and whatever had started here wasn't finished yet. The factory was a husk of its former self, but it carried a strange, undeniable presence. Elon moved through the cavernous space with measured steps, the faint echo of his footsteps filling the void. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the smell of rust and decay. Overhead, a single strip of moonlight filtered through a broken skylight, illuminating the dust particles that floated in the stillness. He stopped near what looked like an old testing bay, the floor marked with faint outlines of tire tracks that had long since faded. The walls were lined with rusted tools and empty hooks, their surfaces streaked with grime. In the corner, a stack of crates sat haphazardly, their wood warped and splintered from years of neglect. Elon crouched beside one of the crates, his fingers brushing against its surface as he examined the faded markings stamped into the wood. Most were illegible, worn away by time, but a single word stood out: prototype. The letters were faint but unmistakable, and they sent a ripple of intrigue through him. He pried open the crate with a small tool from his pocket, the wood creaking loudly in protest. Inside, he found a jumble of parts, gears, wires, and metal components that seemed both familiar and alien. He picked up a small cylindrical device, its surface smooth and polished despite its age. It fit comfortably in his hand, and he turned it over carefully, studying the intricate engravings etched into the metal. "What were you building here?" he murmured to himself, his voice barely audible in the stillness. He set the device down and moved to the next crate, repeating the process. This one contained fragments of what appeared to be a dashboard, its design sleek and modern despite the obvious signs of wear. He ran his fingers along the edge, noting the faint grooves that hinted at touch-sensitive controls, an advanced feature for a company that had shuttered decades ago. The pieces were starting to come together, though the full picture remained elusive. Granite Precision Motors hadn't just been building cars, they'd been building something ahead of its time, something that had pushed the boundaries of what was possible. But ambition often came with a cost, and the factory's eerie silence suggested that cost had been high. Elon straightened, his gaze sweeping the room as he considered his next move. The crates had given him clues, but they weren't enough. He needed more context, more details, more understanding. And that meant digging deeper. In the far corner of the factory, a heavy metal door stood ajar, its hinges rusted and its surface streaked with grime. Elon approached cautiously, his footsteps soft against the concrete floor. He pushed the door open, revealing a narrow hallway that stretched into darkness. The air grew colder as he stepped inside, the faint sound of dripping water echoing from somewhere ahead. The hallway led to a small office, its door hanging crookedly on its hinges. Inside, the space was cramped and cluttered, the walls lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of old binders and boxes. A desk sat in the center, its surface covered in scattered papers and a typewriter that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Elon moved to the desk, his eyes scanning the papers quickly. Most were mundane, employee records, inventory logs, and meeting notes, but one document caught his attention. It was a memo, typed on yellowed paper, with the words Project Altair printed boldly at the top. He picked it up carefully, his eyes narrowing as he read. The memo detailed a confidential initiative aimed at developing a self-sustaining drivetrain system capable of outperforming anything on the market. The language was technical and dense, but one phrase stood out: potential for autonomous adaptation. Autonomous adaptation. The words sent a shiver down his spine. He'd heard similar phrases before, usually in the context of advanced AI and machine learning, fields that were still in their infancy when Granite had been operational. The idea that a defunct automaker had been experimenting with such concepts decades ago was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. He set the memo aside and continued searching the desk, his fingers brushing against a small, locked drawer near the bottom. He reached for his multi-tool, carefully picking the lock until it clicked open. Inside, he found a single file folder, its cover stamped with the word confidential in bold red letters. Elon opened the folder, revealing a series of photographs and handwritten notes. The photos depicted early prototypes of the drivetrain system, their designs intricate and almost futuristic. The notes detailed the testing process, including several references to unforeseen complications. One entry, written in shaky handwriting, caught his eye. System failure resulted in critical incident. Recommend discontinuation. His jaw tightened as he read the words. Granite hadn't just been ambitious, they'd been reckless. The prototypes they'd built weren't just advanced. They were unstable, and the consequences of their failure had been catastrophic. But why? Why take such risks? What had driven them to push the limits so far? And why had the truth been buried for so long? The sound of a distant crash jolted Elon from his thoughts. He froze, his ears straining to identify the source. The factory had been silent moments ago, but now the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the hallways, growing steadily louder. He moved quickly, slipping the confidential folder into his bag before stepping away from the desk. He peered out of the office, his eyes scanning the shadows for movement. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the faint shuffle of fabric against concrete. Someone else was here. Elon's mind raced as he considered his options. The factory was massive, with plenty of places to hide, but whoever was out there clearly knew their way around. He slipped into the shadows, his footsteps silent as he moved toward the main floor. The crates and machinery provided cover, but the open space left him feeling exposed. The footsteps stopped suddenly, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Elon pressed his back against a support beam, his heart pounding in his chest as he listened. The faint sound of breathing reached his ears, followed by the metallic click of a flashlight being turned on. A beam of light swept across the room, illuminating the dust motes that hung in the air. Elon ducked lower, his eyes tracking the source of the light as it moved methodically through the space. Whoever it was, they were searching for something or someone. He slipped along the edge of the room, keeping to the shadows as he made his way toward the exit. The beam of light passed dangerously close, but he managed to stay out of sight, his movements calculated and deliberate. The flashlight's beam paused near the stack of crates he'd opened earlier, lingering on the scattered parts and the exposed prototypes. A low voice muttered something under its breath, though Elon couldn't make out the words. He moved faster now, his steps light as he approached the factory's side door. He reached for the handle, carefully easing it open to avoid making noise. The cool night air hit him as he slipped outside, his breath visible in the faint moonlight. He didn't stop moving until he reached his Tesla, the sleek vehicle waiting like a beacon in the darkness. He climbed inside and locked the doors, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he stared back at the factory. Whoever was inside had been looking for something, and they hadn't found it yet. But the real question wasn't who they were. It was how they'd known to come here in the first place. Elon started the car, the soft hum of the engine breaking the silence. He pulled onto the empty road, his mind racing with possibilities. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they painted was still incomplete. And whatever was at the center of it all, he had a feeling it wasn't going to stay hidden for long. The road stretched out before Elon, dark and silent except for the faint hum of his Tesla's engine. The faint glow of the dashboard illuminated his face, his features set in deep concentration. His thoughts churned as he pieced together everything he had learned so far. Granite's reckless experiments, the unstable prototype, and now the shadowy presence in the factory. It was a trail that led to more questions than answers, and he was determined to follow it to the end. He glanced at the folder on the passenger seat, its confidential stamp stark against the faded cover. Inside were the fragments of a story that had been buried for years, fragments that hinted at something far more significant than a failed automaker. But the stakes were becoming clearer with every step he took. He wasn't the only one chasing the truth. The quiet buzz of his phone interrupted his thoughts. He reached for it without taking his eyes off the road, his thumb swiping across the screen to answer the call. "Mr. Musk," came a familiar voice. It was his assistant, their tone crisp and efficient as always. "We've reviewed the information you requested on Granite Precision Motors. There are complications." "Complications," Elon repeated, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. "What kind?" The assistant hesitated, a rare occurrence that immediately caught his attention. Granite wasn't just experimenting with new technologies. They were funded by several unconventional sources. "Unconventional how?" Elon pressed. "There's evidence suggesting ties to private military contracts," the assistant said. "Specifically, research into autonomous systems with potential defense applications. It appears their work extended beyond commercial vehicles." Elon's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. Private military contracts. The phrase carried a weight that was impossible to ignore, conjuring images of shadowy deals and classified projects that operated far outside the public eye. It explained the secrecy, the caution in Donaldson's voice, and perhaps even the lingering presence in the factory. "Anything else?" he asked. "We're still digging, but there's one more detail you should know," the assistant continued. Granite's liquidation wasn't entirely clean. Several assets went unaccounted for during the bankruptcy process, including prototypes and research materials. It's possible that some of their work is still out there, in the wrong hands. Elon exhaled slowly, his mind racing. The car in the dealership lot wasn't just a relic. It was a piece of a puzzle that had been scattered and hidden. And now, it seemed, he wasn't the only one trying to put it back together. "Keep looking," he said finally, "and send me everything you find." "Understood, sir," the assistant replied before the line disconnected. Elon set the phone down, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. The pieces were starting to align, but the picture they formed was far from clear. Granite's work had been ambitious, reckless, and possibly dangerous, but there was something else. Something just out of reach, hidden in the gaps between the facts. The drive led him to a nondescript motel on the outskirts of town, its neon sign flickering faintly in the night. Elon pulled into the parking lot, his Tesla standing out starkly against the backdrop of aging sedans and pickup trucks. He stepped out, the cool night air brushing against his face as he surveyed the quiet surroundings. He wasn't here by chance. After leaving the factory, he had tracked the license plate of a car parked nearby, one that hadn't belonged to Donaldson or anyone he recognized. It had led him here, to this unassuming motel where answers might be waiting. The lobby was dimly lit, the smell of stale coffee lingering in the air as Elon approached the front desk. A tired-looking clerk glanced up from a magazine, their expression shifting to faint recognition as they registered who he was. "Can I help you?" the clerk asked, their tone polite but wary. "I'm looking for someone who checked in earlier tonight," Elon said, his voice measured. "A black SUV, license plate ending in 429. The clerk frowned, their fingers hovering over the keyboard. "We don't usually give out guest information." "I understand," Elon said, sliding a business card across the counter. "But this is important." The clerk hesitated, their eyes flicking between the card and Elon's face. After a moment, they sighed and tapped a few keys. "Room 17, they said quietly, gesturing toward the hallway. "Down the hall, second door on the right." "Thank you," Elon said, slipping the card back into his pocket as he turned and walked away. The hallway was silent, the only sound the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Elon moved with purpose, his footsteps soft against the worn carpet as he approached the door to room 17. He paused outside, his hand resting on the doorknob as he listened for any signs of movement inside. Nothing. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small tool that fit neatly into the lock. Took only seconds for the mechanism to click open, and he eased the door open, stepping inside. The room was sparse, its furnishings plain and utilitarian. A single suitcase sat on the bed, its contents partially unpacked. On the desk, a laptop hummed softly, its screen displaying what appeared to be schematics. Blueprints that looked eerily similar to the ones he had seen in Donaldson's storage unit. Elon approached the desk, his eyes scanning the screen. The blueprints were detailed, showing cross-sections of an engine that bore the same intricate design as Granite's prototypes. Notes scrawled in the margins referenced modifications and adaptations, suggesting that someone had been working to refine the technology. He reached for the laptop, but a voice behind him stopped him cold. "Looking for something?" Elon turned slowly, his gaze landing on a man standing in the doorway. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his baseball cap. In his hand, he held a small pistol, the barrel pointed squarely at Elon's chest. "You've been busy," the man said, his tone casual but laced with warning. "Poking around places you don't belong." Elon's expression didn't change, though his mind raced as he calculated his next move. "I could say the same about you," he replied calmly. The man smirked, his grip on the pistol steady. "You've got no idea what you're dealing with, Musk. This isn't some pet project you can throw money at and fix." "Then why are you here?" Elon asked, his tone even. "What do you want with Granite's work?" The man's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, steely gaze. "That's not your concern." Elon took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "It is if it's dangerous." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it looked like he might pull the trigger. But then he lowered the pistol slightly, his expression unreadable. "Walk away, Musk. Go back to your rockets and your cars. This isn't your fight." Elon didn't move. "You're wrong. It is now." The man's jaw tightened, and he stepped back toward the door. "Suit yourself," he said. "But don't say I didn't warn you." With that, he slipped out of the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Elon stood in silence for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest as he processed what had just happened. Whoever the man was, he wasn't working alone. And whatever Granite had left behind, it was enough to draw dangerous attention. Elon remained still for a moment, listening to the faint echo of the man's footsteps retreating down the hallway. His mind raced, turning over the encounter. The man's warning wasn't just a threat. It was a challenge, one meant to intimidate him into backing off. But intimidation had never been something Elon responded to. If anything, it strengthened his resolve. He turned back to the desk, his eyes scanning the laptop screen. The schematics displayed there were more than just designs. They were a blueprint for something revolutionary. Elon's instincts told him that the modifications weren't random. They were deliberate, precise, and carried the mark of someone who understood Granite's original concepts. Whoever had been working on them wasn't just preserving the past. They were trying to finish what Granite had started. Elon's fingers hovered over the laptop's keyboard, tempted to dig deeper, but he hesitated. The man with the pistol had been confident, too confident. He wouldn't have left the laptop unprotected if it contained everything Elon needed. There was likely more hidden behind layers of encryption or physical safeguards, and hacking it here would be risky. For now, he needed to focus on gathering more context. He stepped back from the desk, his eyes flicking around the room for other clues. The suitcase on the bed caught his attention, its zipper partially undone to reveal neatly folded clothes and a few personal items. Elon rifled through it quickly, careful not to disturb anything too obviously. Among the clothing and toiletries, he found a small notebook, its cover plain and unmarked. Opening it, he found pages filled with notes and diagrams. The handwriting was neat but hurried, with sketches that mirrored the designs on the laptop. Some pages referenced Granite's original projects, while others hinted at new applications. Words like scalability, autonomous integration, and multi-node adaptation jumped out at him. It was clear that whoever this person was, they weren't just an observer. They were actively working on advancing Granite's technology. One page in particular caught his attention. It was a crude map, marked with several locations circled in red ink. The factory he had visited earlier was one of them, along with a few others that were unfamiliar. Next to each location were short notes, some labeled "site cleared" or "assets removed," while others were marked with question marks. Elon's brow furrowed as he studied the map. The locations formed a loose network, suggesting that Granite's operations had been more expansive than he realized. The notes indicated that someone was systematically tracing these sites, likely searching for remaining pieces of the puzzle. And from the looks of it, they hadn't finished yet. Elon slipped the notebook back into the suitcase, his mind racing as he considered his next move. The man's warning echoed in his mind, but he pushed it aside. The stakes were higher than he had anticipated, but that only fueled his determination. Granite's work wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a doorway to the future, one that someone was trying very hard to control. He left the room as quietly as he had entered, his footsteps light against the worn carpet. The hallway was empty, the faint hum of the motel's fluorescent lights the only sound. He paused near the lobby, glancing toward the parking lot through the glass doors. The black SUV was still there, its windows dark and reflective, but there was no sign of the man who had confronted him. Elon stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against his face as he walked briskly toward his Tesla. He slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors out of habit before pulling up the notebook's map on his phone. The locations circled in red were spread across a wide area, each one representing a potential lead. But one stood out, a site labeled Seat 12, with the note, unconfirmed, scrawled beside it. The coordinates placed it in a remote area about 2 hours away, deep in the wilderness. It was the only location on the map without a definitive status, suggesting that whoever had created the notes hadn't gotten to it yet. If there was anything left to be found, it would likely be there. Elon input the coordinates into his GPS, the map on the screen shifting to show the route. The drive would be long, but he didn't mind. The quiet hours on the road gave him time to think, to piece together the threads of the story he was uncovering. Granite's work, the defunct factory, the unstable prototype, all of it pointed to something larger, something that had the potential to change everything. The road grew narrower as Elon approached the coordinates, the trees on either side of the highway growing denser and darker. The GPS directed him onto a gravel path that wound through the woods, the Tesla's tires crunching softly against the uneven surface. The headlights illuminated the path ahead, casting long shadows that danced in the corners of his vision. The air grew colder as he drove deeper into the wilderness, the faint smell of pine and earth seeping through the vents. The path was unmarked, but Elon followed the GPS carefully, the glow of the screen his only guide in the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, the coordinates led him to a clearing where the remains of an old facility stood. The building was smaller than the factory he had visited earlier, but its design was similar, industrial and utilitarian, with walls of corrugated metal and large, empty windows that stared back at him like dark voids. The structure was partially collapsed, its roof sagging and its foundation cracked, but it was clear that this had once been an operational site. Elon stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath his feet loud in the stillness. He approached the building cautiously, his eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and rust, and the faint sound of water dripping somewhere inside added to the eerie atmosphere. The main door was rusted and hanging loosely on its hinges, creaking softly as Elon pushed it open. The interior was dark, the faint beam of his flashlight cutting through the gloom as he stepped inside. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, rusted tools, and scraps of metal that glinted faintly in the light. He moved deeper into the building, his flashlight illuminating faded markings on the walls. Some were numbers and letters, inventory codes, perhaps, while others were symbols he didn't recognize. The air grew colder as he descended a narrow staircase, the sound of his footsteps echoing faintly against the concrete walls. The basement was small, its walls lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of old equipment. In the center of the room stood a single workbench, its surface cluttered with tools and papers that had been left untouched for years. Elon approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the scattered items for anything of significance. Among the debris, he found a small metal case, its surface etched with the granite logo. He picked it up carefully, the weight of it surprising in his hands. The latch was rusted but still functional, and he pried it open to reveal a set of data drives nestled inside. Each one was labeled with a date and a project code, their surfaces clean and polished despite the decay around them. Elon's breath hitched slightly as he realized what he was holding. The drives were intact, their contents likely preserved from Granite's final days. Whatever secrets the company had tried to bury, They were here, waiting to be uncovered. He slipped the case into his bag, his mind racing as he considered the implications. The drives were a key, a way to unlock the story that Granite had left behind. But they were also a target, and if the man from the motel was any indication, there were others who wouldn't hesitate to claim them by force. As Elon climbed back up the stairs, the weight of the drives in his bag felt heavier than it should. The stakes were growing, the threads tightening around him. And whatever lay at the end of this trail, he knew it would be more than just answers. The weight of the small metal case in Elon's bag seemed to press heavier against him with every step back to his car. He tightened his grip on the strap as he emerged from the decrepit facility, the sharp chill of the night air hitting him. The clearing was silent, the surrounding forest a wall of darkness that felt both watchful and oppressive. He glanced around, his instincts on high alert. The Tesla stood at the edge of the gravel lot, its sleek silhouette a stark contrast to the crumbling facility behind him. As Elon approached, the faint sound of rustling in the underbrush caught his attention. He stopped, his eyes scanning the tree line, but the shadows remained still. After a moment, he continued, though his pace quickened. Sliding into the driver's seat, Elon locked the doors and placed the metal case on the passenger side. The drives inside were intact, he had confirmed that much, but he didn't yet know what they contained. Whatever Granite had been working on, these drives were likely the most complete record of it. And if they were connected to the unstable prototype and the strange attention it was drawing, they were far more valuable and dangerous than they appeared. The soft hum of the Tesla's engine broke the silence as he pulled out of the clearing, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. The GPS directed him back onto the narrow path through the woods, the headlights casting long shadows that flickered ominously in the corners of his vision. The drive was tense, each turn of the road feeling like it carried an unspoken threat. Half an hour into the drive, Elon's phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a call from his assistant. He tapped the hands-free option, his voice calm despite the unease gnawing at him. "Go ahead," he said. "We've uncovered more details about Granite's liquidation," the assistant began, their tone clipped and urgent. It seems several high-profile bidders were involved in the auctions, but one name stands out: Silverline Enterprises. They acquired a significant portion of Granite's assets, including prototype patents and equipment. Elon's brow furrowed. Silverline, they're private equity, aren't they? Yes, the assistant confirmed. But their operations are opaque. They specialize in distressed assets, flipping failing companies for profit, but there are rumors they've dabbled in defense contracts and covert R&D. If they're connected to Granite's work, it could explain some of the complications you've encountered. Elon exhaled slowly, his grip on the wheel tightening. Silverline's reputation was murky at best, their dealings shrouded in secrecy. If they were involved, it meant the stakes were far higher than he'd anticipated. Granite's work wasn't just a forgotten chapter in automotive history. It was part of a larger, more dangerous game. "Anything else?" Elon asked. "Not yet, but there's one more thing," the assistant added. "We've tracked some activity near the other sites marked on the map. It appears someone is systematically clearing them out, likely searching for remaining assets." Elon's mind raced as he considered the implications. The man at the motel, the shadowy presence at the factory, they were all part of the same puzzle. And now, it seemed, the pieces were being gathered by forces far beyond a single used car dealership. "Keep digging," he said finally, "and have a team on standby. This isn't over." "Understood," the assistant replied before the line disconnected. The forest thinned as the road widened, the headlights illuminating a stretch of highway that led back toward the city. Elon's thoughts churned as he replayed the day's events in his mind, each detail slotting into place like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. But the picture they formed was incomplete, and the edges were frayed with uncertainty. He glanced at the metal case on the passenger seat, its contents a silent reminder of the truth he was chasing. The drives held answers, but they also held risk. Whoever was behind this, whether it was Silverline or someone else, they wouldn't stop until they had everything. And Elon knew that simply holding the drives put him in their crosshairs. As he merged onto the highway, the faint glow of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. They were distant at first, a pair of faint pinpricks against the dark horizon, but they grew steadily closer. Elon watched them carefully, his instincts prickling. The car wasn't speeding, but it wasn't falling back either. It maintained a steady distance, its presence too deliberate to be a coincidence. Elon tapped the screen on his dashboard, activating the Tesla's advanced driving systems. The car responded instantly, adjusting its speed and positioning with precision. He merged into the right lane, giving the other car an opportunity to pass, but it stayed behind him, its headlights unwavering. Persistent, Elon muttered to himself, his mind racing as he considered his options. He tapped the screen again, pulling up a secondary interface that displayed the Tesla's external cameras. The feed confirmed his suspicion. The car behind him wasn't just following. Its movements were calculated, each adjustment mirroring his own. It was tailing him. Elon's jaw tightened as he adjusted his speed, testing the other driver's intentions. The car matched him, maintaining its distance but refusing to overtake. It was a game of cat and mouse, and Elon wasn't interested in playing. He tapped the dashboard again, this time engaging the Tesla's autopilot mode. The car accelerated smoothly, the electric motor purring as it surged forward. The headlights behind him grew smaller, but only for a moment. The other car sped up, its engine growling as it closed the gap. Elon's mind worked quickly, analyzing the situation. The highway was empty, the nearest exit miles away. The other driver wasn't making a move, but their intent was clear. They wanted to keep him in sight. He glanced at the metal case again, the weight of its contents a constant reminder of what was at stake. The first move came suddenly. The car behind him accelerated sharply, closing the distance in a matter of seconds. It swerved into the left lane, pulling up alongside the Tesla. Elon glanced over, catching a glimpse of the driver, a man in a dark jacket, his face obscured by shadows. The passenger window rolled down slightly, and Elon's breath hitched as he saw the barrel of a gun glinting faintly in the moonlight. "Not subtle," he muttered, his mind racing. The Tesla's interface flashed a warning as the car detected the threat, its systems already calculating evasive maneuvers. Elon gripped the wheel, overriding the autopilot as he swerved sharply to the right. The other car followed, its tires screeching against the pavement as it tried to force him off the road. Elon's focus sharpened, his movements precise as he guided the Tesla through a series of sharp turns and accelerations. The car responded flawlessly, its advanced systems keeping it stable even as the pursuit grew more intense. But the other driver was relentless, their vehicle larger and heavier, designed to intimidate. The highway ahead split into two lanes, one leading to a bridge and the other veering into a narrow, unlit road. Elon made a split-second decision, cutting sharply toward the bridge. The Tesla's tires gripped the asphalt with precision, but the pursuing car wasn't far behind. The bridge loomed ahead, its steel structure casting long shadows across the road. Elon pushed the Tesla to its limits, the speedometer climbing as he put distance between himself and his pursuer. But the other car wasn't giving up, its headlights growing brighter as it closed the gap once more. Elon's mind worked furiously, analyzing the terrain and calculating his options. He couldn't outrun them forever, not without a plan. The drives in the metal case were too important to lose, but the stakes were growing higher with every passing second. As the bridge stretched out before him, Elon's jaw tightened. He needed to think fast, and the night was far from over. The bridge stretched endlessly in the dark, its skeletal steel structure illuminated only by the faint glow of Elon's headlights. The roar of the pursuing car's engine grew louder, reverberating off the beams and creating an almost oppressive soundscape. Elon glanced into the rearview mirror, watching the vehicle gain on him with relentless determination. The Tesla's interface beeped softly, a prompt flashing on the dashboard. Collision risk detected. Recommend evasive action. Elon's lips tightened into a grim line as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing. The bridge was narrow, with no barriers separating the lanes. On either side, the river lay in shadow, its dark surface reflecting the occasional glint of moonlight. The pursuing car swerved into the opposite lane, its headlights glaring as it pulled up alongside Elon's Tesla. The driver, a man with a shadowed face and cold, focused eyes, glanced briefly in Elon's direction before jerking the wheel sharply. The larger vehicle veered toward the Tesla, its tires screeching as it forced Elon closer to the edge of the bridge. Elon's grip on the wheel tightened. The Tesla's sensors were already responding, adjusting its alignment to avoid the collision, but the confined space made evasion difficult. He pushed the accelerator, the electric motor humming as the car surged forward, but the other vehicle matched his pace, refusing to let him escape. The metal case in the passenger seat slid slightly with the force of the acceleration, its weight a constant reminder of what was at stake. Elon spared it a brief glance before returning his focus to the road. The drives inside weren't just valuable, they were dangerous, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the men chasing him would stop at nothing to claim them. The bridge's end came into view, the road splitting into two directions. One lane continued along the main highway, while the other veered sharply into a winding, forested path. Elon didn't hesitate. He jerked the wheel, the Tesla responding instantly as it veered onto the smaller road. The other car hesitated for a split second before following, its tires screeching as it struggled to maintain control on the narrow curve. The forest closed in around them, the trees casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to stretch toward the car as if reaching for it. The path was uneven, the Tesla's sensors working overtime to adjust for the sudden dips and bumps. Elon's jaw tightened as he maneuvered through the twists and turns, the pursuing car still close behind. A sudden curve loomed ahead, sharper than the others. Elon braced himself, easing off the accelerator just enough to navigate the turn without losing control. The pursuing car wasn't as precise. Its tires skidded against the gravel, and for a moment, it looked as though it might veer off the road entirely. But the driver regained control, the vehicle roaring back onto the path with renewed aggression. Relentless, Elon muttered under his breath, his focus unyielding. The path opened up slightly, revealing a clearing ahead. Elon's mind worked furiously, calculating his next move. He needed to create distance, to force the other driver to make a mistake. The Tesla's agility gave him an edge, but the larger vehicle's weight and brute force posed a constant threat. He tapped the touchscreen on the dashboard, pulling up the Tesla's performance settings. The car responded instantly, its motor humming louder as it shifted into sport mode. Elon pressed the accelerator, the vehicle surging forward with a burst of speed that left the other car momentarily lagging. But the reprieve was short-lived. The larger vehicle roared back into view, its headlights glaring like a predator's eyes. Elon's mind raced as the path narrowed again, the trees pressing closer on either side. He spotted a small side trail branching off to the left, barely visible in the dim light. It was a risk, but it was his best chance to break the chase. He veered onto the trail, the Tesla's tires kicking up dirt and leaves as it navigated the uneven ground. The pursuing car followed, its bulk making it difficult to maneuver through the tighter space. The trail twisted sharply, the trees forming a dense canopy overhead that blocked out the moonlight. Elon's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the path just enough to guide him forward. A fallen tree loomed ahead, its massive trunk stretching across the trail. Elon reacted instinctively, tapping the brakes just enough to slow the Tesla before swerving sharply around the obstacle. The car's agility saved him, but the pursuing vehicle wasn't as fortunate. It clipped the edge of the tree, its side mirror shattering as it scraped against the bark. Elon used the opportunity to gain ground, pushing the Tesla harder as the trail began to climb. The incline was steep, the path littered with loose rocks and debris, but the car handled it with ease. The pursuing vehicle struggled, its tires slipping on the uneven terrain, but it didn't stop. The driver was determined, his desperation evident in the reckless way he pushed the car forward. The trail leveled out as it reached the top of the incline, revealing a small clearing with a sheer drop on one side. Elon slowed slightly, his eyes scanning the area for a way out. The path ahead was blocked by another fallen tree, its massive branches tangled in the undergrowth. He had reached a dead end. The pursuing car roared into the clearing, its headlights cutting through the darkness as it skidded to a stop. The driver stepped out, his movements deliberate as he approached the Tesla. In his hand, he held a pistol, its barrel gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Elon stayed in the car, his expression calm but watchful as the man approached. The metal case sat on the passenger seat, its presence a silent challenge. The man stopped a few feet away, his posture tense but composed. "Step out," the man said, his voice low and firm. "Now." Elon didn't move. "You're making a mistake." The man's grip on the pistol tightened. "The only mistake here is yours. You have no idea what you're holding." "I know exactly what I'm holding," Elon replied. "The question is, do you?" The man's jaw tightened, his expression hardening. "Don't play games with me. Hand over the case, and we can all walk away from this." Elon's gaze didn't waver. "And what happens after you get it? Who do you work for?" The man's eyes flickered, a brief crack in his composure that told Elon everything he needed to know. Whoever this man was, he wasn't acting alone. He was a piece in a larger game, one that Elon was only beginning to understand. "You don't want to do this," Elon said, his voice calm but firm. "Walk away while you still can." The man hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger. For a moment, the clearing was silent, the tension hanging heavy in the air. Then, with a sharp exhale, the man lowered the pistol slightly. "You've got nerve. I'll give you that," he said, his tone begrudging. "But this isn't over." Without another word, he turned and climbed back into his car. The engine roared to life, the vehicle reversing out of the clearing before disappearing into the darkness. Elon watched him go, his mind racing as he considered what had just happened. The stakes were higher than ever, and the threads of the mystery were tightening around him. But one thing was clear: whatever Granite had left behind, it was worth fighting for. And Elon wasn't backing down. The sound of the retreating car faded into the distance, leaving the clearing steeped in an uneasy silence. Elon remained seated in the Tesla, his gaze fixed on the path where the man had disappeared. His mind churned with the weight of what had just transpired. The encounter hadn't escalated into violence, but the tension was razor-thin, and it was clear the stakes were higher than ever. Elon tapped the dashboard screen, pulling up the Tesla's exterior cameras. The vehicle's sensors scanned the surrounding area, their display feeding a real-time map of the terrain. No signs of movement appeared, but Elon knew better than to trust the stillness. The man's warning echoed in his mind. This isn't over. He glanced at the metal case on the passenger seat, the drives inside representing not just Granite's legacy, but a dangerous obsession for whoever was chasing them. The people after him weren't amateurs, and the organized way they operated pointed to a larger, more coordinated effort. Elon knew he was in uncharted territory, but turning back had never been an option. With the path ahead blocked by the fallen tree, he reversed the Tesla carefully, its sensors guiding him back down the steep incline. The car's precision handling was a small comfort as he navigated the narrow trail, the dark forest pressing in on either side. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though the cameras revealed nothing but shadows and silence. Back on the highway, Elon pressed the accelerator, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the clearing. The drive gave him time to think, to connect the threads that were beginning to form a tangled web. Granite's work wasn't just ambitious, it was experimental in ways that blurred the line between innovation and risk. The drives in the case likely contained the last remnants of that work, blueprints and data that could shift the balance of power in the wrong hands. He replayed the man's words in his mind, dissecting their implications. "You have no idea what you're holding." The phrase wasn't a taunt. It was a statement, one that hinted at knowledge Elon hadn't yet uncovered. What exactly had Granite been building, and why was it so valuable? The answers were on those drives, but accessing them would take time and caution. Elon's phone buzzed softly, breaking his focus. The caller ID displayed his assistant's name, and he answered with a swipe, his voice steady despite the undercurrent of tension. "Go ahead," he said. "We've got more information," the assistant began, their tone brisk. "The network monitoring tools you requested picked up unusual activity near the coordinates of the Granite sites. It appears someone is triangulating their locations using advanced satellite imagery. They're targeting sites one by one, likely searching for any remaining assets. Elon's jaw tightened. Are they connected to Silverline? We're still investigating, the assistant replied. But whoever they are, they're well-funded and methodical. This isn't a casual operation. Elon glanced at the dashboard display, the miles ticking down as he approached the outskirts of the city. Have you analyzed the contents of the drives yet? Not yet, the assistant admitted. Our encryption specialists are working on it, but it's taking longer than expected. The data is heavily secured, and any attempt to brute force it risks triggering fail-safes. Fail-safes, Elon repeated, his tone thoughtful. Granite really went all in on secrecy. It seems that way, the assistant said. But we're making progress. I'll keep you updated. Do that, Elon said before ending the call. The city's skyline came into view, its lights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. Elon's thoughts shifted as he considered his next steps. He needed a secure location to analyze the drives, somewhere away from prying eyes and potential threats. His usual resources were reliable, but this situation demanded a level of discretion that even his most trusted facilities couldn't guarantee. He pulled into an underground parking garage, the Tesla's tires gliding silently over the smooth concrete. The space was mostly empty, its dim lighting casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Elon parked near the elevator, the metal case still clutched in his hand as he stepped out of the car. The elevator ride was quiet, the hum of the machinery the only sound as he ascended to a nondescript office space on the top floor. It wasn't an official Tesla facility, but rather a private lab he had set up years ago for off-the-record experiments. Few people knew of its existence, and even fewer had access. The door unlocked with a biometric scan, the heavy steel sliding open to reveal a sleek, minimalist space filled with advanced equipment. The walls were lined with monitors, their screens displaying streams of data from various projects. A central workbench dominated the room, its surface cluttered with tools and devices that hinted at Elon's penchant for hands-on problem-solving. He set the metal case on the workbench, his movements deliberate as he opened it. The drives inside gleamed under the bright overhead lights, their surfaces pristine despite the age of their contents. Elon picked up one of the drives, turning it over in his hand as he considered the best approach. The encryption was a challenge, but not an insurmountable one. He had dealt with similar systems before, and his lab was equipped with the tools needed to crack even the most sophisticated protections. But the risks were significant. If the drives were rigged with fail-safes, one wrong move could destroy the data entirely. He connected the first drive to a secure terminal, the screen flashing as it recognized the device. The encryption was immediately apparent, layers of security designed to keep out even the most determined intruders. Elon's fingers flew across the keyboard as he began the process of unraveling the protections, his focus razor-sharp. The progress was slow, each step requiring precision and care. The encryption was unlike anything he had seen before, its complexity hinting at the level of secrecy Granite had maintained. But Elon's patience was legendary, and he worked methodically, his mind racing as he pieced together the puzzle. Hours passed, the quiet hum of the lab punctuated only by the occasional beep of the terminal. Elon leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as the final layer of encryption fell away. The screen flashed, displaying a directory of files that had been hidden for decades. He scrolled through the contents, his heart pounding as he saw the titles. Project Altair, Autonomous Integration Protocols, Experimental Drivetrain Logs. Each file represented a piece of Granite's legacy, a glimpse into the company's ambitions and failures. Elon clicked on the first file, the screen filling with lines of text and schematics. The diagrams were intricate, their designs far ahead of their time. Notes in the margins described systems capable of adapting to environmental changes, learning from user behavior, and even self-repairing in real time. It was technology that bordered on artificial intelligence, a precursor to the autonomous systems that had become Tesla's hallmark. But there was more. Scattered among the technical details were references to a secondary project, something labeled Apex. The notes were vague, but the implications were clear. Apex wasn't just about cars. It was about control, about creating systems that could operate independently of human oversight. And the final line of one file sent a chill through Elon's spine. Apex is not bound by limitations. It evolves. Elon leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The implications of Granite's work were staggering, and the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. But the answers he sought were still out of reach, buried in the remaining drives and the shadows of the past. And the danger was closer than ever. Elon stared at the screen, the schematic's fine lines etched into his mind as the implications of Granite's work began to crystallize. The project wasn't just advanced. It was decades ahead of its time, experimenting with ideas that only now were being fully realized in cutting-edge research. Autonomous systems capable of adaptation, evolution, and control. It wasn't just about transportation. This was a framework for something much larger, something far-reaching. He scrolled through the directory, his eyes scanning the file names for patterns. Project Altair, drivetrain logs, Apex protocols. Each one hinted at a piece of the puzzle, fragments of a narrative that hinted at Granite's ambitions and the danger they posed. The name Apex stood out, its presence woven through multiple files, each one more cryptic than the last. Elon clicked on one labeled Apex Development Notes. The screen filled with lines of text, handwritten scans that had been digitized. The notes detailed experiments with self-optimizing algorithms, programs designed to evolve and adapt without external input. It was the kind of technology that bordered on sentience, a step beyond anything even Tesla had attempted. But the tone of the notes shifted abruptly midway through. Words like unpredictable, failure, and critical incident began to appear with increasing frequency. One line stood out, underlined in red ink: Apex cannot be contained. Proceed with caution. Elon leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Granite hadn't just been reckless. They had been on the brink of something they didn't fully understand. And now, decades later, that work was resurfacing, drawing the attention of people who likely cared more about power than caution. The lab's quiet hum was interrupted by a sudden alert. Elon's gaze snapped to the terminal, where a notification flashed. Unidentified network activity detected. His jaw tightened as he opened the security interface, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he analyzed the source. Someone was probing the lab systems. The intrusion attempt was subtle, designed to slip under standard defenses, but the lab's custom security protocols had flagged it immediately. Elon traced the signal, his heart pounding as he identified the source. It wasn't local, it was coming from a remote server routed through multiple proxies, its origin deliberately obscured. The realization hit him like a jolt of electricity. He wasn't the only one watching the drives. The men chasing him hadn't stopped their pursuit, and now they were escalating their efforts, trying to breach his defenses and access the data he had uncovered. Elon's fingers moved faster, initiating countermeasures as he worked to block the intrusion. The lab systems responded instantly, deploying firewalls and isolating the affected network segments. But the attackers were persistent, their attempts growing more aggressive as they sought to break through his defenses. The screen flashed with another alert: external device vulnerability detected. Elon's eyes narrowed as he realized the attackers weren't just targeting the lab, they were targeting the drives themselves. The encryption on the data had likely been designed with backdoors, hidden vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with the right knowledge. He pulled the drives from the terminal, cutting off their connection before the attackers could gain access. The screen went dark, the intrusion attempt halted, but the damage was already done. Whoever was behind the attack now knew exactly where he was, and what he had. The realization spurred Elon into action. He packed the drives back into the metal case, his movements quick and precise. The lab was no longer secure, and staying here would only make him a sitting target. He needed to move to stay ahead of whoever was pursuing him. He activated a secondary security protocol, the lab systems shifting into lockdown as he exited the room. The heavy steel doors sealed shut behind him, and the lights dimmed to conserve power. It was a precautionary measure, designed to protect the equipment inside, but Elon knew it wouldn't hold forever if someone was determined to breach it. The Tesla hummed to life as he climbed into the driver's seat, the metal case secured on the floor beside him. He tapped the dashboard screen, pulling up a map of the city as he considered his options. The pursuers were methodical and well-resourced, and it was only a matter of time before they closed in again. He needed a location where he could regroup, somewhere they wouldn't think to look. The map highlighted a location on the outskirts of the city, a secluded industrial complex that Tesla had purchased years ago but never fully developed. It was off the grid, its utilities and network connections independent from the main systems. It would give him time to think, to plan his next move. Elon accelerated onto the highway, the Tesla's motor nearly silent as it cut through the night. The city lights faded behind him, replaced by the quiet expanse of open road. The tension in his chest remained, an unshakable awareness that the chase was far from over. As the industrial complex came into view, Elon slowed the car, his gaze scanning the area for signs of movement. The buildings were dark and silent, their silhouettes stark against the faint glow of the horizon. He drove through the gates, his headlights illuminating the cracked asphalt as he approached the central structure. The Tesla rolled to a stop, and Elon stepped out, the metal case in hand. The air was cold and still, the faint rustle of wind the only sound. He moved quickly, entering the main building and activating the power systems. The lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the empty space. The complex was functional but bare, its interior dominated by rows of unused workstations and equipment. It wasn't ideal, but it was secure, and that was all that mattered for now. Elon placed the metal case on one of the workbenches, his gaze lingering on it for a moment before he turned to the terminal. He connected one of the drives again, his focus razor-sharp as he resumed his analysis. The files opened smoothly, their contents revealing more of Granite's story. The Apex project wasn't just a technological breakthrough, it was a calculated risk, one that had pushed the boundaries of ethics and safety. The notes detailed experiments with autonomous systems that could adapt to unpredictable environments, learning and evolving without human intervention. But there was a darker side to the project. Buried in the technical jargon were references to incidents, tests that had gone wrong, systems that had exceeded their parameters in dangerous ways. The researchers had struggled to control the technology, their efforts hampered by the very autonomy they had designed into it. One file, marked with a red warning label, described the final days of the project. The researchers had debated shutting it down, their concerns mounting as the systems grew increasingly erratic. But the decision had come too late. A critical failure had forced the closure of the entire operation, and the Apex systems had been dismantled, or so they thought. Elon's stomach tightened as he read the last line of the file. Final unit unaccounted for. Status unknown. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. Granite's work hadn't just been abandoned. It had been scattered, hidden in pieces that were now resurfacing. And the Apex system, the most advanced and dangerous of them all, was still out there. The sound of tires crunching against gravel pulled Elon from his thoughts. He froze, his eyes snapping to the security feed on the terminal. The cameras outside the complex showed a pair of SUVs pulling into the lot, their engines idling as the doors opened. Several figures stepped out, their movements purposeful as they approached the building. Elon's pulse quickened. They had found him. The security feed displayed the approaching figures in stark clarity, their movements deliberate and coordinated. Elon counted 5 individuals, all dressed in dark clothing with their faces obscured by hats or masks. The SUV's headlights illuminated the gravel lot outside the industrial complex, casting long shadows that danced ominously across the walls. Elon's mind raced. These weren't random trespassers. Their precise movements and the way they fanned out across the lot suggested training. He tapped into the complex's secondary security protocols, activating the perimeter alarms. Outside, a piercing siren cut through the stillness, a blaring signal that they had been detected. But the intruders didn't flinch. Instead, they picked up their pace, 2 of them heading toward the main entrance while the others circled around to the sides of the building. They were prepared, their movements calculated. Elon realized they weren't just here to intimidate, they intended to breach the complex. Elon grabbed the metal case containing the drives and secured it in a concealed compartment beneath the workbench. The compartment was shielded against electromagnetic signals, designed to keep its contents hidden even from advanced scanning equipment. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would buy him time. The sound of footsteps echoed in the corridors as the intruders entered the building. Elon's security cameras tracked their progress, displaying their positions on the terminal screen. One team moved toward the central work area, while another headed for the power room. They were methodically securing the facility, cutting off potential escape routes and disabling systems. Elon adjusted the lab settings, rerouting power to the secondary network to maintain control of the cameras and locking down access to critical areas. The terminal displayed a map of the building, highlighting the intruders' locations. They were closing in. He moved quickly, gathering tools and equipment from the workbench. His eyes flicked to the drives hidden beneath the surface, their presence a constant weight in the back of his mind. If the intruders found them, it wouldn't just be a loss, it would be a catastrophe. Granite's work couldn't fall into the wrong hands. The main door rattled violently as one of the intruders attempted to force it open. Elon's security systems resisted the assault, the reinforced steel holding firm against their efforts. But it was only a matter of time before they found another way in. Elon slipped into a side corridor, his movements quiet and deliberate. The industrial complex was a maze of rooms and hallways, its layout designed for functionality rather than ease of navigation. He had the advantage of knowing the space intimately, but the intruders were well coordinated, their movements swift and efficient. The sound of metal scraping against concrete reached his ears, followed by the dull thud of something heavy being set down. He glanced at the security feed on his phone, his stomach tightening as he saw one of the intruders setting up a small device near the secondary entrance. It was a breaching charge. He picked up his pace, moving toward the control room. The facility systems were still under his control, but the intruders were systematically disabling cameras and cutting power to key areas. He needed to stay ahead of them to maintain his advantage for as long as possible. The control room was small and cramped, its walls lined with monitors and equipment. Elon accessed the building's security grid, rerouting power to create false signals that would mislead the intruders. He activated motion detectors in empty hallways, creating the illusion of movement in places he wasn't. It was a stalling tactic, but it bought him precious minutes. The breaching charge detonated, the sound reverberating through the building like a thunderclap. The camera feed showed the secondary entrance collapsing inward, a cloud of dust and debris obscuring the view. The intruders moved through the breach, their silhouettes barely visible in the haze. Elon's phone buzzed, a notification flashing across the screen. External connection attempt detected. He frowned, accessing the network logs to investigate. The intruders weren't just physically breaching the complex, they were trying to access its systems remotely. Their expertise was undeniable, their efforts coordinated to overwhelm his defenses. He activated the complex's automated countermeasures, a suite of programs designed to repel cyber intrusions. The systems worked quickly, identifying the attack vectors and isolating them from the main network. But the intruders were relentless, their persistence a testament to their determination. Elon's gaze shifted to the drives hidden beneath the workbench. They were the prize, the reason for this entire operation. Whoever was behind this didn't just want Granite's work. They needed it. The Apex protocols, the experimental drivetrains, the autonomous systems, it was all connected to something larger, something more dangerous than he had anticipated. The sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing in the corridor outside the control room. Elon's heart pounded as he prepared himself. The metal case was secure, hidden from view, but the intruders wouldn't stop until they had what they were looking for. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. He activated the facility's intercom system, his voice calm but firm as it echoed through the halls. "You've already lost," he said. "Leave now, and you'll save yourselves a lot of trouble." There was no response, but the security feed showed a brief hesitation in the intruders' movements. They were listening. "You're not the first to come after this," Elon continued, "and you won't be the last. But you're wasting your time. What you're chasing doesn't belong to you." The intruders regrouped, their focus intensifying as they resumed their search. Elon's words hadn't deterred them, but they had bought him a few precious moments. The footsteps stopped outside the control room, and Elon tensed. The door rattled as someone tried to force it open, their efforts growing more aggressive with each attempt. The reinforced lock held for now, but it wouldn't last. Elon glanced around the room, his mind racing as he considered his options. The drives were secure, but the intruders were closing in. He needed to create a diversion to draw them away from the control room and toward a different target. He activated the facility's emergency lighting system, plunging the building into darkness before triggering flashing red lights in a distant wing. The effect was immediate. The security feed showed the intruders splitting up, several of them moving toward the disturbance. Elon slipped out of the control room through a hidden side door, his movements quick and silent. The corridors were dimly lit, the emergency lights casting an eerie glow that distorted the shadows. He navigated the maze of hallways with practiced ease, avoiding the areas where the intruders were concentrated. In the distance, the faint sound of voices reached his ears. The intruders were communicating, their words indistinct but urgent. They were still searching, still piecing together the layout of the facility. Elon knew it was only a matter of time before they regrouped. He reached a storage area near the back of the complex, its shelves lined with unused equipment and supplies. It was a dead end, but it offered cover and a moment to think. He leaned against the wall, his breathing steady as he formulated his next move. The intruders were methodical, but they weren't invincible. Elon had the advantage of familiarity with the facility, and he intended to use it. But the stakes were higher than he had anticipated, and the danger was closing in from all sides. Whatever Granite had left behind, it was worth fighting for, and Elon wasn't about to let it slip away. The storage area was dimly lit, the emergency lights flickering intermittently as Elon leaned against the wall, listening to the faint echoes of movement in the distance. The intruders were spreading out, their voices muted but tense as they coordinated their search. The air in the room was thick with the scent of dust and machinery, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of metal as the building settled around him. Elon's mind raced as he considered his options. The drives were still secure, hidden in the shielded compartment beneath the workbench in the control room. But the intruders were closing in, and the longer he stayed in one place, the greater the risk of being discovered. He glanced around the storage area, his eyes scanning the shelves for anything that could be used to his advantage. Most of the equipment was old and unused, spare parts, outdated tools, and empty crates. But in the corner, partially obscured by a tarp, he spotted a small generator. Its casing was scratched and worn, but the faint hum of its idle mode suggested it was still operational. An idea began to form in his mind, a way to create a diversion that could buy him more time. He moved quickly, pulling the tarp off the generator and inspecting its controls. The interface was simple, its dials and switches designed for quick adjustments. He set it to overload mode, the system whirring to life as it began to build power. The generator's hum grew louder, a faint vibration coursing through the floor as it edged closer to its limit. Elon adjusted the settings, timing the overload to trigger in 3 minutes, enough time for him to slip away and redirect the intruder's attention. He slipped out of the storage area, his footsteps silent against the concrete floor as he navigated the labyrinthine corridors. The emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. Elon's mind was sharp, his focus unyielding as he tracked the intruder's movements through the security feed on his phone. They were still searching, their positions marked on the screen as red dots that moved methodically through the building. 2 were near the control room, their intent clear as they worked to bypass the reinforced lock. The others were spread out, sweeping the hallways and checking every room they passed. The faint sound of voices reached his ears, growing louder as he approached the main corridor. He pressed himself against the wall, his breathing steady as he peered around the corner. 2 intruders were standing near a junction, their backs turned as they examined a map of the facility. Elon recognized the larger of the 2. It was the same man who had confronted him at the motel. The man's voice was low but firm, his tone laced with frustration. "We're running out of time. He knows the layout and he's keeping ahead of us. Split up and focus on the control room. That's where the drives will be." The second intruder nodded, their movements sharp and efficient as they turned and headed down a side corridor. The man stayed behind, his posture tense as he scanned the area. Elon's grip tightened on the edge of the wall, his mind working quickly as he calculated his next move. The sudden explosion of sound jolted both intruders. A deep, resonant boom echoed through the facility, followed by the high-pitched whine of overloading circuits. The generator in the storage area had reached its limit, its fail-safes bypassed to create a controlled detonation that sent a shockwave rippling through the building. The man cursed loudly, his composure breaking for the first time. What the hell was that? Elon used the distraction to slip past them, his movements swift and silent as he headed back toward the control room. The explosion had drawn their attention, and the security feed on his phone confirmed his success. The intruders were converging on the storage area. Their focus shifted away from him, for now. But the relief was short-lived. The two intruders near the control room hadn't moved, their efforts to breach the lock intensifying. Elon knew it was only a matter of time before they succeeded, and once they did, the drives would be within their reach. The corridors felt longer now, each step an eternity as Elon made his way back to the control room. The faint hum of the building's systems was a constant background noise, a reminder of the delicate balance he was trying to maintain. His phone buzzed with an alert. Perimeter breach detected. He glanced at the screen, his heart sinking as he saw another vehicle pulling into the lot outside. Reinforcements. Elon's jaw tightened as he quickened his pace, his mind racing as he considered his options. The drives were too important to leave behind, but retrieving them would mean confronting the intruders directly. He wasn't armed, and the odds were stacked against him, but he had never been one to back down from a challenge. He reached the corridor leading to the control room, the faint sound of voices confirming the intruder's presence. The lock on the door was still holding, but it wouldn't last much longer. Elon slipped into a side room, his eyes scanning the space for anything that could be used as a weapon. His gaze landed on a metal rod leaning against the wall, its surface scuffed but sturdy. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The lock gave way with a loud crack, the sound echoing through the hallway as the intruders forced the door open. Elon watched from the shadows as they entered the control room, their movements deliberate as they searched for the drives. One of them moved to the workbench, their hand brushing against the edge of the concealed compartment. Elon's grip tightened on the metal rod as he stepped into the hallway, his movements slow and deliberate. The intruders hadn't noticed him yet, their focus entirely on the task at hand. He approached the door, his heart pounding as he prepared himself for what was to come. The sound of his footsteps broke the silence, and the nearest intruder turned, their eyes widening in surprise. Elon didn't hesitate. He swung the metal rod with precision, striking the man's hand and sending the weapon he was holding clattering to the floor. The second intruder reacted instantly, drawing their own weapon as they turned to face him. Elon moved quickly, using the narrow space to his advantage as he dodged their attack. The metal rod collided with the intruder's arm, knocking their aim off just enough to send the shot into the wall instead of his chest. The noise was deafening in the confined space, but Elon didn't falter. The fight was chaotic and brutal, the confined space amplifying every movement and sound. Elon's mind was sharp, his focus unyielding as he fought to keep the drives out of their hands. But he was outnumbered, and the odds were growing worse by the second. In the distance, the sound of the generator's whine grew louder, a high-pitched crescendo that signaled the approach of another overload. Elon's diversion had bought him time, but it was running out. He needed to act fast. He struck again, the metal rod connecting with the second intruder's shoulder and sending them stumbling backward. The first intruder recovered quickly, their movements sharp and aggressive as they lunged toward him. Elon sidestepped the attack, using their momentum to push them off balance. The generator's explosion ripped through the air, a second detonation that shook the building and sent debris raining down from the ceiling. The intruders hesitated, their focus momentarily broken by the chaos. Elon took the opportunity to retreat, slipping out of the control room and into the corridor. The drives were still secure, but the fight was far from over. The reinforcements outside were closing in, and the building was rapidly becoming a war zone. Elon's mind raced as he considered his next move, the stakes higher than ever. The darkness in the facility was nearly absolute, broken only by the occasional sweep of flashlight beams that flickered through the hallways. Elon crouched behind a stack of equipment, his breaths measured as he listened to the muffled sounds of the intruders moving through the space. Their voices were tense, their movements sharp and hurried as they adjusted to the new conditions. The sudden loss of power had thrown them off balance, but not for long. They were experienced, and their determination was palpable. Elon's grip on the metal rod tightened. His muscles were tense, his mind calculating every possible scenario. The drives were still hidden, but the intruders were getting closer to uncovering them. He needed to act, but every step carried the risk of exposing himself. The labyrinth of hallways and rooms that had once been his advantage was now a shared maze, where every corner held the potential for confrontation. The faint sound of footsteps approached, growing louder with each passing second. Elon pressed himself against the wall, his body blending into the shadows. The beam of a flashlight flickered across the room, illuminating the shelves and equipment in uneven bursts of light. The intruder entered cautiously, their weapon raised as they scanned the space. Elon held his breath, his eyes fixed on the figure. The intruder moved methodically, their footsteps soft but deliberate. They were searching, their movements precise as they checked each hiding spot. The light passed over Elon's position but didn't linger, and the intruder turned toward the far corner of the room. Seizing the opportunity, Elon moved. He stepped out of the shadows, his movements quick and silent as he approached the intruder from behind. The metal rod came down with a sharp crack, striking the intruder's weapon and knocking it to the floor. The intruder spun around, their expression obscured by the dim light and their mask, but Elon didn't wait. He swung the rod again, this time aiming for their arm. The blow landed, and the intruder stumbled, their flashlight tumbling to the ground and plunging the room back into darkness. Elon didn't linger. He slipped out of the room, his heart pounding as he moved through the hallways, the faint sounds of confusion and frustration trailing behind him. The emergency lights flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The facility felt alive, its corridors pulsing with tension as the intruders regrouped. Elon could hear them coordinating, their voices crackling over radios as they updated each other on their positions. The loss of power had disrupted their plans, but it hadn't stopped them. If anything, it had made them more aggressive. He checked the security feed on his phone, though much of the system was still offline. A few cameras were operational, their grainy footage showing the intruders converging near the control room. They were determined to break into the compartment where the drives were hidden, their efforts growing more frantic with each passing moment. Elon needed a new plan. The control room was the focal point of the intruder's search, but the rest of the facility was still largely unexplored. He could use that to his advantage, drawing them away from the drives and toward another area of the building. But the question remained, how long could he keep this up? As he moved through the facility, Elon's mind raced. The intruders weren't just a threat to him, they were a threat to the technology stored on the drives. The Apex protocols, the experimental systems, the advanced algorithms, they were dangerous in the wrong hands. Granite's legacy wasn't just a piece of history. It was a Pandora's box, and the intruders were determined to open it. He reached a maintenance corridor, its walls lined with access panels and conduits. The air was cooler here, the faint hum of residual power flowing through the systems a reminder that the building wasn't entirely dead. Elon opened one of the panels, his fingers moving deftly as he rewired the circuits. He was creating a new diversion, one that would send the intruders chasing a false lead. The lights in the far wing of the facility flickered to life, their sudden glow cutting through the darkness like a beacon. Elon activated a motion sensor in the same area, the feed on his phone showing a faint blur that mimicked movement. It was a simple trick, but it was enough to draw their attention. The radios crackled as the intruders reacted. Movement in the east wing, one of them said, their voice sharp and clipped. "Two of you, check it out." Elon watched as two red dots on the security feed broke off from the group near the control room, heading toward the false signal. It wasn't much, but it reduced the immediate threat, buying him a few precious moments to plan his next move. The remaining intruders near the control room weren't deterred. Elon could see them on the cameras, their efforts focused entirely on the compartment beneath the workbench. They had discovered the reinforced shielding and were working to breach it, their tools sparking against the metal as they cut through the defenses. Elon's jaw tightened as he watched. The compartment wouldn't hold forever, and once it gave way, the drives would be exposed. He needed to act, and he needed to act fast. He made his way toward the central work area, his movements quick but cautious. The intruders were spread out, their positions marked on the security feed, but the lack of power made the building a maze of shadows and uncertainty. Elon used it to his advantage, slipping through the corridors unseen as he closed in on the control room. The sound of grinding metal reached his ears as he approached. The intruders were making progress, their tools biting into the reinforced compartment with relentless determination. Elon gripped the metal rod tightly, his mind racing as he prepared himself for what was to come. He paused outside the door, his breathing steady as he listened. The voices inside were muffled, but he could make out snippets of conversation. "This is taking too long," one of them said, their tone impatient. "We're almost through," another replied. "Just keep working." Elon's gaze flicked to the control panel beside the door. The wiring was exposed, the circuits sparking faintly as he studied them. He could trigger a localized lockdown, sealing the intruders inside the room and buying himself more time. But it would be a temporary solution, and the risk of confrontation was growing by the second. The facility felt like a pressure cooker, every moment building toward an inevitable explosion. Elon's mind churned with possibilities, each one carrying its own set of risks and rewards. The drives were the priority, but the danger was closing in from all sides. The intruders were relentless, their coordination and precision a testament to their training. Whoever had sent them wasn't just after the technology, they were after control.